Are we about to repeat the lost decade of the 1970s? Today's stagflationary economy, with high inflation and slow growth, will look familiar to anybody who lived through the 1970s. Not only the stagflation, but the social unrest, decaying cities, and political polarization all might feel disturbingly familiar to those who thought gas lines, bell bottoms, and Captain and Tennille were all behind us. For the past year, my base case has been that we are repeating the 1970s, the most salient feature of which was a double peak stagflation that ultimately lasted roughly 8 years. Perhaps this time paired with a 2008-style financial crisis that will ultimately convert into yet more inflation. So what happened in the 1970s? The story starts in the 60s when Washington opted for, quote, guns and butter, meaning enormous welfare spending paired with foreign wars, which might also sound familiar. That drove inflation to 5% and 6.5% by 1970. Foreign countries began to redeem their inflating dollars for gold. The French famously sent a warship to pick up their gold, an unmistakable symbolic gesture. Nixon responded by ending the gold window, which cut off the last remnant of the gold standard. This, of course, unchained Congress to spend whatever its shriveled heart desired. Inflation hit 12% by 1974, at which point, like today, the Fed furiously hiked rates ultimately to almost 13%. That did bring down inflation for a few years, but at the cost of a savage recession as the private sector was choked off. The first quarter of 1975, the economy contracted by 5% annualized, which at the time was reported at roughly twice that, so 10%. That spooked the Fed, who declared victory and slashed rates all the way back down to 5%. What happened next? Why, inflation soared once again, the infamous camelback shape I've talked about in recent videos. That second inflation was actually much worse than the first, with higher inflation that lasted twice as long, ultimately more than 5 years. At the time, many commentators worried that inflation might be permanent, but it was at that moment that the country got the Fed chair it needed, Paul Volcker. Ironically appointed by the inflationist Jimmy Carter, Paul bit the bullet and hiked rates to an eye-watering 19%. That set off the mother of recessions, ultimately a double dip that cost Jimmy Carter the presidency. So what's next? Brought to you by Unchained. My biggest fear is that if we are reliving the 1970s, it could last a lot longer this time, for two reasons: Volcker and debt. On Volcker, I think we're very unlikely to get another savior, because Paul Volcker was, from Washington's perspective, a giant mistake. He saved the country, yes, but he cost Jimmy Carter his job, while he cost Democrats their 50-year near monopoly on the Senate. So Washington is unlikely to make that mistake again. The second reason is debt. In the 1970s, Nixon had just killed off the gold standard, so we didn't have anywhere near the amount of debt that we have today. So federal debt today is almost 100 times bigger than it was in the 70s, while private debt is roughly 50 times bigger. So 19% rates today are essentially impossible. They would destroy consumers and businesses, meaning voters, and they could set off a sovereign debt crisis. So if Washington does stumble back to the 70s, I am afraid it could run a lot longer than a decade. Check out the full article at profsainaj.com, including impact on investors, including gold and real estate, and how they either protected themselves or thrived in the chaos. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.